Probably we could start.
Мы готовы начинать.
Да, я перейду, с вашего позволения, тогда.
We're ready to start. I'm going to switch to Russian and I'll ask Alexander Boldareva to introduce our session. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we continue with our conference and we are happy to welcome all of our panelists. This is going to be an international session. Earlier today, we started talking about sustainable development goals, but we will only start talking about this in earnest in this particular session. The title of this session is What do foundations need SDGs for, and what do SDGs need foundations for? Our moderator for the session will be Olga Bashkirova, Renova Foundation. Yes, Alexander, thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be the moderator at such a star-studded panel, because our speakers today represent major foundations, major international organizations. I think this is going to be a very interesting and productive discussion. At least I, for my part, will do my best to make it interesting for you. So without further ado, I'd like to tell you that in this session, we'll talk about practical applications. Why do foundations need SDGs? Because the situation with business is pretty clear. Companies use SDGs to increase their investment appeal. But if we talk about private foundations, corporate foundations, why do they need SDGs? And what role do foundations play for the SDGs? Our first speaker today is Marcus Arias Neto, UN Development Program, Finance Sector Hub Director. The floor is yours, Marcus.
Sorry, I'm back. You know, somebody was telling me the other day that the most spoken phrase in the world in 2020 is "you are muted." So sorry that I was muted. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everybody. I'm speaking to you from New York City, the United States. It's 7 o'clock in the morning here. My name is Marcus Neto. I'm the director of the SDG Finance Sector Hub at the United Nations Development Program. We are the largest UN agency in the world with the mandate to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a mandate given to us by the United Nations General Assembly. So I come to you, and perhaps I'm the first one to speak in this important panel, to kind of give you a little bit of context of how do we see, with our presence in 170 countries around the world, the current situation that we see in the world. I think we are in unprecedented times. This is a cliche, everybody says this, but it is indeed, because it is the first time in 100 years, at least, that all of us experience the same phenomenon. You know, we all have experienced lockdowns. We all have become very equally versed on working through these screens and Zooms and whatever else we are doing here. We all have to deal with, at least in my case, you know, teenage kids inside the house that are very unhappy to be locked down with parents. And that has the potential to bring all of us together. And I think perhaps that is the mantra of what I would like to talk today, from individuals to countries to systems to different stakeholders. The notion that we are experiencing everything at the same time everywhere in the world, right? And there is a need for us to come together and to figure out how do we deal with this. This crisis is bigger than any one single stakeholder can do: governments, multilateral systems, philanthropy, business. To give an idea, we at UNDP have been running the Human Development Index, right? So it's a 30 years old index that has measured human development across several different variants. One constant for 30 years is human development has improved everywhere in the world for the last 30 years, no longer. For the first time in 30 years, human development is on course to decline, right? And whoever is in high development is going to go down and down and down and down. This is a profound change. 100 million people are going to get on poverty by the end of this year. So the SDGs, which were not already on track, are seriously off track coming out of this. But this is also an opportunity. Former Prime Minister from the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill, used to say, let's not let a crisis go to waste. That is exactly the moment we have here, right? If we come together, we can actually use this opportunity, to reboot the world economy, to deal with some fundamental systemic and profound issues that are the back end, right, of the current crisis, being biodiversity loss, being climate change, being inequalities around the world. So for us at the United Nations, when the crisis started, we launched a socioeconomic response, because let's be honest, in some countries of the world, this was a health crisis first, who then became a socioeconomic crisis. In other parts of the world, like Africa, because of the mitigation strategies put it very early on, it was actually a socioeconomic crisis before it was a health crisis, right? So you have 155 million jobs have been lost worldwide, right? We know that women and girls and minorities and people that are the so-called essential workers, which tend to be poorer people, are even more affected. So what we decided to do is that we had to understand all over the world what this is. So we as UNDP are the technical lead across the entire United Nations system on the socioeconomic response. We have conducted 90 socioeconomic impact assessments around the world, and now those assessments are leading to socioeconomic recovery plans, which are essential elements of how does governments come out of this situation, not only in the short term, but also how does those socioeconomic recovery plans are used to tilt recovery towards the SDGs as we are basically the decade of action, the last 10 years of the SDGs, right? So all of those socioeconomic impact assessments and recovery plans are available. They are public. You can go to the UNDP website and they're all going to be there. We as UNDP are focusing on implementing those recovery plans around 4 areas: governance, social protection, a green economy recovery, and a digital disruption. I think we all learned that one of the factors of inequality growth or not in the future will be access to digital technology and the capacity to use the technology. So for us, it is very important that we move forward in that way. And there is an essential element and an essential importance, right, of bringing together different stakeholders. And perhaps I'll stop here with this big picture scenario. And Olga, I know that you might have a more specifically philanthropy. What is its role going forward?
Exactly. My question was, what is the contribution of the philanthropy in response of the COVID-19? And what is, the sustainable goals of, sustainable development goals? What makes the philanthropic organization, strategic partners for the multi-stakeholder collaboration?
Thank you. We always believe at UNDP on the importance of philanthropy as stakeholder in development, right? So back in 2014, we've partnered up with a series of philanthropic organizations, the Ford Foundation, the Hilton Foundation, and created a platform called the SDG Philanthropy Platform, right? And we've actually took this platform worldwide, developing countries, and we took the platform to Kenya, to Brazil, to Indonesia, to Zambia, Ghana, to several countries. Why did we do that? Because we believed 2 things. One, the SDGs at that time, 2014, we were creating the SDGs. The SDGs would benefit from the voice of philanthropy, from the experience and for the vision of philanthropy, which that happened. But more important afterwards is, how does philanthropy, which has financial resources, but also has experience, it has networks, it has, scientific thinking, how does philanthropy come together with the other stakeholders to address the SDGs? Now, if you fast forward to the moment that we're in now, we can use those socioeconomic recovery plans as an example, right? It is exactly the same scenario, if you want. you as a philanthropic organization can decide to go alone, right? And say, okay, here's what I'm going to do to respond to COVID. The question is, there is not as much, there's a limitation, there is a ceiling of what you can do alone. But if you are able to understand what is the governor of Kenya, or what is the governor of Russia, what is the governor of South Africa doing, and that is representing those socioeconomic recovery plans, and what is the role? How do you contribute? How do you align your expertise, your network, your financial resources to the same goals? If you do that, right, I think you are in a position that your resources can go much further and much faster if it tied up to the same kind of highway, if you want, in which governments and business and multilateral and NGOs are all going in that direction. So we, through the SDG philanthropy platform, which is now a partnership between UNDP and the Wings network, are making available and are trying to bring it all, as many philanthropists as we can, into those socioeconomic recovery plans. So come back to us after that. And I think that's where the importance lies, for philanthropy to come together, not necessarily to hand up your money to governments. That's not what we're talking about, but to fully understand where the entire development community is going, and then, decide, look, I'm going to invest in education, sure, but how does your investment in education align with the economic recovery plans and the SDG plans of a government? So that's the importance for us, and the role we are prepared to play in helping facilitate it, bringing all those stakeholders together. We are doing this in Kenya. We are doing this in several other governments and countries around the world. Finally, I'm happy to say that philanthropy has been playing an amazing role, right? I think, in the United States alone, $11.9 billion of philanthropic money has been allocated in the last 6 months to respond to COVID. So it's a huge input, but more important than that, the nature of that money has been changed. Philanthropy has understood that the recipients perhaps need more flexibility, that there is a reality of the head counts and the overheads, and starting to allow for those to happen, so organizations can actually survive this crisis in that sense. And we are also seeing a tremendous amount of innovation and cyclical role by large philanthropic organizations. The example I like to give is the Ford Foundation, which thought initially in the crisis that its endowment was going to go down. Right, it turned out that the stock market didn't go down, so the endowment didn't go down. And rather than reducing its grant making, realized that the market is giving money for almost for free in the United States, and issue a social bond, raise $1 billion in the market against its endowment to be paid in 30 years of very, very low risk, and is actually doubling its grant making from $500 million to $1 billion. Innovations like that are essential going forward, and that sense of responsibility that it is not time to retrench, it's not time to reduce my grant making, it's actually time to double down and provide more grant making. But then I would argue, provide the grant making in a way that aligns with what the governments and the stakeholders are doing, so we all together can go much further and faster, in recovering better, in recovering in a way that we actually address some of the biggest problems that COVID has put a spotlight on. COVID didn't create inequality. COVID didn't create climate change, but it has shown us how unprepared as a global society we are to deal with things like that. And we better use this opportunity to fundamentally change, because there are more, pandemics and crises just waiting around the corner. Thank you.
Маркос, спасибо большое. Это потрясающе, очень.
Thank you very much, Marcus. This was really impressive and inspiring. Marcus mentioned that the foundations can play a very big role in attaining the SDGs. Next, we will go to Oksana Oricheva, representing the Potanin Foundation. That's a private foundation. And Oksana will tell us about her experience. What do you think, Oksana, about the SDGs, and what role do they play in your activities? Oksana? Hello, thank you for such an interesting topic, and thank you for making me part of this discussion. If you don't mind, I will answer the question that we have in the title of this session. Why does philanthropy need SDGs, and why do the SDGs need philanthropy? And this does not directly affect our foundation activities. I'll just share a broader picture. I spoke on this matter recently at a Wings event. That's part of the platform that Marcus mentioned, SDG philanthropy platform. I think it's very important to point out that initially the SDGs and philanthropy, even though these are different terms, these two things are closely interrelated. In our daily work, whether we say it explicitly or not, and by our work, I mean philanthropy. It doesn't matter if it's private, individual, local, whatever. In our work, even if we don't use this term, Sustainable Development Goals, explicitly, all those things, all those SDGs are present in our work. We don't have to talk about this. That's something that we're already doing. We have been doing this even before SDGs. So we have the common foundation. Globally speaking, our goal is to make our society better, to improve the quality of people's lives today and tomorrow, because we're also talking about the future. We are taking a long-term approach. We want our society to be better and more just. The philanthropic agenda, even though the SDGs have been here for a while, still I would say it's a relatively new phenomenon. With philanthropy, on the other hand, if we forget about corporate foundations, corporate philanthropy, for a very long time, SDGs remain kind of invisible for philanthropy. So on the one hand, what I mean is you have your practical activities, what you do, yet SDGs remain pretty much invisible. We don't talk about this. And let me give you a little bit of our history. I was trying to remember, about 5 years ago, we started working on our new strategic vision in our foundation, and we also started thinking about SDGs. And we were wondering if we should include SDGs in our daily activities. So after a lot of discussions, eventually we concluded that this was unnecessary. You may ask me why. And still today, we don't think we absolutely have to include SDGs in our strategy. I think there are 3 key barriers or challenges. For a long time, SDGs and philanthropy have been kind of running on parallel tracks without intersecting. The first reason is, you might call it lost in translation. It's like speaking different languages. The language used by philanthropy and people who work with SDGs. If we consider philanthropy and the NGO sector in general, we spend most of our time at what you might describe as the grassroots level. All the things we do, everything we work with is grassroots. So I'm not sure we need to add this high-level language of SDGs to our practical grassroots activities. And philanthropy was there a long time before. It's been centuries, many centuries, and they were philanthropic activities for a very long time before we had SDGs. That's what I mean by lost in translation. We have this new global phenomenon, SDGs. How do we integrate SDGs into our well-established philanthropic system? I'm pretty sure we're talking about the same thing, yet it's like we speak in different languages without understanding each other. This really reminds me of this movie, Lost in Translation. For other stakeholders, the government, businesses, they really do need this language of the SDGs. It really helps them to understand each other. But with philanthropy, I don't know. I don't know how to reconcile these two things. This second barrier that I see, it's related to the first one. If we take a look at philanthropy, there is always a local level, local community. How do you marry the local level of communities, the local level of operation with SDGs? Because SDGs are global. They're not even national. That's a global level. So these two things, they can complement each other, but it takes a special effort to marry a global phenomenon and local work. And we need to understand why we need to marry these two things. And the third challenge that I see here, it has to do with the partnerships. And this is where philanthropy and SDGs have more common ground than in any other area. And I'm not just talking about SDG 17, partnership. I mean, SDGs cannot be attained on your own. You have to partner up. And philanthropy, too, is all about partnership. Whatever you do in philanthropy, you need partners. It's about changing relationships within this sector. And this requires a whole another level of partnership. All kinds of different resources need to be combined together. One more thing, when we consider SDGs and philanthropy, we can go to the basic values, underlying values of these two phenomena. What lies underneath the SDGs and underneath philanthropy? And we can see this again through partnership. Partnership will help us overcome these three barriers, initial barriers. And actually, we started coping with these three barriers through SDG 17, which is about partnership. Partnership provides us with common language. And philanthropy needs SDGs because this is another opportunity for us to expand our borders and expand our partnership. I apologize for repeating the same word again and again. So I think we can change a lot of things by partnering SDGs and philanthropy. But coming back to what I started with, it's not like we are going to include SDGs in everything we do, because philanthropy is often informal. Let me conclude with a specific example of culture. For some reason, culture was not included in SDGs as a separate goal, yet culture goes through all the 17 SDGs. The same with philanthropy. The culture of philanthropy brings us all together. It's present in all the SDGs. So that's my answer. I cannot answer in a simple way, but that's actually, thank you. You anticipated our coming discussion. This is something we were going to talk about, and I really hope we can save some time at the end of the session to have a discussion, because you're right, we have more questions than answers. That's wonderful. I have a very brief question, because I want us to move on to the next stage. What do you think? Does Russia have its own approach on SDGs, or are we no different from other countries? Are we just following in the global track? Olga, you can't answer a question like that briefly. I can say yes and no. Every country is special in its own way, and yet all countries exist in a global space. Oh, okay, I'm happy with this answer. Okay, if you don't mind, I want to move on to our next speaker, Max von Abendroth. Max is the executive director at Daphne, Donors and Foundations Network in Europe. Max, could you please comment on our agenda today? Maybe you could comment on what other speakers said. So Max, the floor is yours.
Very much, Olga, for the warm welcome and the introduction, and for having me here. I will probably be the one giving you a little bit more of a helicopter perspective, because I'm working for the European umbrella organization of foundations and donors, Daphne, based in Brussels in Belgium. And we have 30 members, that they are national associations. The Russian Donors Forum is one of them, in 28 countries. And through these members, we represent around 10,000 foundations across Europe. Daphne is very much an infrastructure organization to empower all these national associations to do a more effective job at national level, and to help them to learn from each other and to inspire each other. In this context, we set up PEX earlier this year. PEX is a European forum for all kinds of philanthropy networks in Europe. So that includes also European networks, that includes the community foundations, and thematic networks like Ariadne for the human rights, Edge Funders for the systemic change foundations, and so on. And this is the place where a lot of the discussions happen that are relevant for the topic of today. So if you look at Daphne and PEX, then we are certainly closely linked to the SDG goal number 17, partnership for the goals. And there's another one which I would also like to build on to make it a bit more concrete, and that is the goal number 13 about climate action, which we are now taking on since a few months. The SDGs are very prominent on the agenda of our members across Europe, but in very different ways. So in Italy, you have one approach, in Germany, another one. The community foundations, again, addressing it slightly different. So there's a lot of diversity in the sector, as the sector in general is diverse. I think one important element here to we should all know, but just to make this point very clear, that philanthropy is so much more than just money and the funding. And I think in all these discussions, this falls a bit short. So philanthropy is, of course, about expertise. It is about networks. It is about the convening power that we have, or the foundations have, to bring people with different backgrounds together, even in unusual constellations. And philanthropy is, and we have seen this through the COVID-19 crisis and heard from Marcos earlier on, is agile. there's a lot of flexibility and ad hoc activities are possible. So that's something that I want to bring to the table. So when you look from the top, these are really the elements that matter next to the funding itself. Let's dive for a second a bit deeper into the climate work, because I think it's a great example to see how the SDGs can be applied. So from the network perspective, so looking from my perspective, what we are currently doing is we are setting up a philanthropy coalition for climate. The idea is to gather networks and foundations who are active in the climate work and help their foundation members to live up to their own ambitions when it comes to climate change on all different levels. So this is like a forum of exchange, of knowledge exchange. We create knowledge up here. We align in communications vis-a-vis the public, but also vis-a-vis key stakeholders. This is happening there. We also introduced within this platform a funder commitment for climate change, which actually started in the UK 1 year ago, is now being implemented in Spain and France, and there are 6 more countries in Europe who would like to do the same at national level. And we are working closely with Wings now to set up also an international funder commitment on climate change. This is a low barrier entry into the climate change or climate action arena for foundations who have nothing to do with climate change when you look at their mission. And this is, I think, the crucial point. Looking at a topic in the SDGs, here in this case, climate change, and looking at it as a cross-cutting issue. How can we make the links between the different fields? One example, Ariadne, Human Rights Foundations, is now applying or engaging with climate change from the just transition perspective. So they are making a lot of studies around this and discussions with their members to understand what does this mean for human rights when we apply a climate change agenda. So this is what we really support, these kind of exchanges. And then we are helping to build infrastructure between all the different organizations that are active in the climate field. So they have climate philanthropy networks, and these networks engage with their foundation members and they run their own agenda. There are 15 of them in Europe. They are hardly connected. They hardly talk to each other. So what we are trying now is to bring them all together. We have actually tomorrow our very first meeting with all of them after a mapping exercise over the summer and start collaboration. 3 things I would like to leave with all of you before I close. First is, as a foundation, I would really recommend you to invest in your networks. This infrastructure is absolutely crucial when it comes to them to play a convening role, a leadership role when it comes to complicated topics. They are acting as facilitators and they give access to knowledge and networks. So it can be really a shortcut for the individual foundations on complex topics. Number 2, think about these issues as a cross-cutting issue. How to do this in the climate field? We just published yesterday together with Active Philanthropy a guide, Funding for the Future, explaining this, how you can do as a foundation approach the climate issue and apply it as a cross-cutting issue program. And the last point is be ready to collaborate. Not just foundation and foundations, but also foundations and civil society organizations, sometimes even the corporate world, and obviously with public authorities. So public-private partnerships, I think, can really drive the agenda. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Макс. У меня к вам будет
Thank you, Max. I have a very short question for you. Or maybe, do you think that regardless of the size of a foundation or an NGO, SDGs are still common, understandable language that everybody can use, a common language which helps to move forward together? So can you say that even though these are big goals and you have sometimes smaller organizations and they might seem that these goals are too remote for them, too far away, can we say that SDGs are just a common language that we all can use to understand each other better?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think, yes, it's necessary to have a common language. So that's why I think the SDGs are doing the trick. It might be difficult indeed for small or very specialized foundations to really understand and apply the kind of language that's used in the SDGs. And I think there's a role to play for networks here to help translating this into concrete action and bringing players together who can help each other and support each other.
Ну, то есть я как раз хотела, собственно, навести нас всех на мысль о том, что...
Yes, that's what I was actually talking about. Organizations like Daphne and the Russian Donors Forum are there to help various NGOs, various foundations to learn this language of SDGs. Okay, let's now move on to Oksana Kosachenko, if she's here. Oksana, if you're online, could you please let us know? No, she's not here yet. Okay, then I will give to Atje Drexler instead. Atje Drexler, Senior Vice President of Robert Bosch Stiftung. Atje, the floor is yours. Again, you may want to say something of your own or comment on what some other speakers said. Anyway, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the Russian Donors Forum for having me in this very interesting conversation this afternoon. Yes, actually, I try to refer to some of the speakers who spoke before me, because quite a number of the notes that I have here on my notepads have already been mentioned. What I found intriguing about when I compare Oksana's and Max's statement is the one about language. Max, who really advocated for the SDGs as a common language, and Oksana, who still claimed that we are somewhat lost in translation. And I must admit that I rather hold with Oksana's view. We underwent a substantial strategic review at the Robert Bosch Foundation in the last 3 years. And of course, we turned to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've reached the same conclusion, as Oksana mentioned, that it is not fully necessary for us to orient our work towards the SDGs in everything we do, because there is that feeling of it is in the DNA of philanthropy to work for sustainability and to work for a more just world now and in the future. But now that we started working on the new topics that we have, first of all, they're all related to the Sustainable Development Goals. So even without trying to orient our works onto the SDGs, when we look at the challenges that this world is facing, as you know, a philanthropic organization that is aware of what's going on around itself, you end up with a strong need to work on climate, a need to work on inequality, a need to look at the way we work, we govern migration, what is happening to democracy and to democracy, what is happening within societies that have become more heterogeneous. So there is, even without trying, you end up with the SDGs. And now that we're starting to implement the projects, the first projects in our new topics, I think that they become even more important, because as the challenges that we have decided to work on are so monumental, you really can't go by yourself. And the language of the SDGs is, for me, is the great translator to the other sectors. So if you don't speak it, it's very difficult to align with government action. If you do, things are much more easier. And I think that it allows you an access to policy and an access to policymakers and policy itself, to international multilateral organizations, and thus to, as Oksana said, it's a method, or it's a way of broadening one's influence, one's sphere of influence, and reaching out to new partners that you may have had difficulties working with before, in a way that I didn't think they would when we were in the strategic process. But now I see the benefit of using it. One of the issues I would like to bring into to this virtual table today is that we were thinking of how can we connect the global discussion and the local level on which many of us fund. And one of the issues that we are looking into is actually work on the use of disaggregated local data in the global discussion. Because when you look at inequality, which is one of the topics that I'm currently overseeing, there is a need to go beyond averages. to go beyond nationally aggregated data, to really understand what is going on, and to design policies and interventions based on reality on the ground. And that is potentially a very good spot for foundations to be in, together with other, for instance, civil society organizations, because that is where we are. This is where we do our work. This is where we know what is happening in many cases. If we can find a way to give this experience and to feed this experience into the Sustainable Development Goals, and also into the fora that go around it, like even the high-level political forum or national reporting, I think that will be a great benefit. And this is something that we pursue. What the discussion of working on the SDGs has also brought to us is a very sincere a discussion that has just started on the power relations that are implicit within philanthropy. I think Oksana mentioned something similar to this. Those who have the financial side of resources and those who have other resources, how do we work together? How do we see that we not, as a cross-cutting issue, take inequality again, that we don't reproduce inequality just because of the fact that we are the ones with money very often. And we get this imbalance in the relations. So what can we do to counter the reproduction of this, to come to a juster world, also in our own fields? And I think that a lot of colleagues, particularly in the United States, are really working on this right now. I don't see this happening so much in Europe yet, maybe with the exception of the EDGE Funders Alliance. So I think this is a very important part of what we do when we reach out to work on sustainable development goals. I also have the impression that the SDGs came into the philanthropy world rather belatedly, but they have started to form sort of hubs where alliances circle around, and you can see that huge funding alliances have been formed around climate change. It's also, I still have the impression it's more of an, let's put it simple, American thing yet still than it is a European one. And it's some of the alliances that have been created, in particular around climate, are so big in terms of the money they have that it's really difficult even for a larger European foundation to get into that, because we can't bring the kind of money to the table that is required for being in. So this is something that our field has to work on. How do we get differently sized organizations to work together? And if you have a high entrance fee, and I'm talking about $2-digit million US per year to be part of the alliance, who can join? Not very many, at least not in our part of the world. So this is something that we should be looking out for. And I think with this, I stop for the moment in order to give more time for discussion and questions that there may be. I don't hear you, Olga.
Sorry, it's just like это вот такая стандартная вещь, которая.
Yes, that's a standard situation. Muted microphone. That's why you can't hear me. I was going to say that I really enjoyed what you just shared, and this had very much in common with what Oksana said. So on the one hand, you are also somewhat skeptical about making SDGs the center of everything we do as private foundations. On the other hand, you see some potential here. I have a kind of tricky question for you. I know that your foundation is no longer a corporate foundation. This is something bigger than just a corporate foundation. But you as the Bosch Foundation, are you still under some kind of influence of SDGs? Because I understand that corporate foundations are interested in SDGs. What about you, though?
Well, I would say, I would try to put it like this: influence, or the Russian влияние, I'm not really sure. So they don't influence us, in an active sense. So we are an independent foundation and we make our own choices. If the corporation where your money comes from declares that they will become CO2 neutral by the end of 2020, as far as I remember, or 2021, then of course you can't sort of stand aside and say, well, there's a multinational corporation with more 400,000 employees, they can do it, but we can't. You know, you don't have any excuse left to say that we, as a small, less than 200 people organization compared to the Bosch Corporation, we can't possibly do that, while they obviously can, and they have projection. So this is a kind of influence by example, I would say, that is happening around climate right now. So we don't want to be, let's simply say, worse than our own corporation. And one thing that really connects us is that we were founded by the same family. So the values that lie at the core of both the company and how it is run and our foundation, they're very similar. We refer back to the same person, Robert Bosch, and his view of the world. And even if that work may not have been fashionable in his lifetime, sustainability was something that he deeply cared about, although he would probably have used some other words for it.
Спасибо большое за ответ. Я, соответственно, передаю слово Фатиме Мухамеджан.
Okay, I give the floor to Fatima Mohamedjan.
Наука и спорт. И как раз, собственно, хорошо, что такое было предвосхищение, да, от АТЕ с точки зрения влияния вообще или компании, или вот основателя фонда, да, на, может быть, те вызовы глобальные или цели устойчивого развития, который может фонд себе имплементировать в такую ежедневную деятельность. Фатима, вам слово, и с точки зрения как бы нашей дискуссии, ее названия, для чего...
Could you please comment either on the title or maybe you could refer to what earlier speakers said? Thank you, Olga, and hello. So, all the participants, this is a very interesting subject. And since I'm one of the last ones, it's hard for me to add anything because basically you've mentioned almost everything I had to say. I just can echo what others said. Oksana and Atia, I fully agree with everything you said. And what you said about Bosch Foundation, the founder, and how this affects both his company, his business, and his foundation. This is really very interesting. So the only thing I can really add is, me too, I think that it's not like we use the SDGs, this specific formulas in our work every day. No. Yet, at the same time, philanthropy has always been closely involved with the subjects that SDGs are about. So it's not like that in 2015 or 2005 when the SDGs emerged, it's not like something new came. No, the whole history of mankind eventually forced us to put these SDGs into words in order to stimulate governments and mankind in general to focus on these issues. So, okay, I represent a private foundation. That's a foundation of a person who decided to give some of his funds to philanthropy, make this a part of his life. Of course, we're talking about major businessmen. The founder of our foundation is one of the biggest donors in the world. And this person definitely follows global trends, and his philanthropic efforts are well aligned with what the global community does today. And SDGs, of course, are an integral part of that. So the efforts taken by this kind of person is definitely in line with the SDGs. So yes, SDGs do play a role in our activities. And I think the philanthropy sector and NGOs are among the most effective tools that can help us implement the SDGs. Like Oksana said, we are grassroots organizations. We are the link between the top level and the bottom level. We are working directly with people. We are working directly with community. We are what brings together the government and people, the government and communities. So we are best positioned to achieve good results. You know, on day one of our conference, we had a professor from the Imperial College of London, Maurizio Zolo. I wrote down something he said. He said, in order for an organization to achieve a real change, you have to go to a personal level, to a behavioral level. So if we talk about a change at the national level, what we need to do is we need to go lower, go to the NGO level, and eventually reach out to people to make change at an individual level. I really like this quote by Churchill that Marcus mentioned. We cannot allow this crisis to go to waste. The situation where the pandemic caused us to reconsider a lot of things. And that's a very good opportunity. The government is now really looking at NGOs. The government realized that NGOs can really help it, can play a big role, at least in Russia. In Russia, we see a lot of progress. NGOs really got a lot of attention from the government right now here. And we believe we can achieve great results if we put this crisis to good use. If we partner up, we have a proper partnership between the government, NGOs, civil society, and this is what is happening right now before our eyes. I think it's very good. For example, let me give you an example. We work in various parts of Russia, and we saw that our communication with the local NGOs is much better now. We set up training programs for smaller local NGOs. We are a major foundation, and yet we are now able to work closely with local smaller NGOs. We became a link that joins the national government and small local organizations. For example, one particular province where we are active is now ranked first in terms of winning government grants. Local organizations there are now much more successful. So this is something that we will continue working on. So SDGs are a very wonderful formula, very wonderful language, which can produce new platforms for us to meet together and work together. But it's not like it's action list for us, checklist that we go over every day. But we always remember about SDGs in everything we do, because it covers everything. Thank you, Fatima. Basically, you touched all the bases. You went over everything we mentioned. Marcus mentioned interaction at all levels. That's one of the key assets that foundations have. It's not just about money. It's about being able to know the situation on the ground. So we're talking about other grassroots, non-financial resources, which are also very important for achieving SDGs. Okay, I think we will go to Yoni now. Yoni Lounasmaa, Executive Director of the Finnish Medical Foundation. And after Yoni, we'll have a discussion, and we saved some time for a Q&A session. Yoni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jouni Lounasmaa. I work at Finnish Medical Foundation based in Helsinki. And I thought I'd give a little bit different perspective on you because we've done some work on the ESG in investing. So I have a few slides for you on that, and I thought that I'd share them. So I'll just put them on. Is it visible now? Can somebody? Yeah, great. So the Finnish Medical Foundation, it's private foundation based in Helsinki. We support medical research in all fields, and we are, I'd say by Finnish standards, a mid-sized foundation. So our assets are about 85 million euros. And I thought it's interesting for you to kind of see what we have been doing with our investments, because we don't have like a large team at our hands to do this. So it's like what is feasible with just a little amount of people. Here's just very briefly like our approach to investing. Very I'd say standard thing. What we do, we have outsourced the asset management. So we have two main portfolio managers. 65% of investments is in liquid equity. And we are committed to ESG, meaning that we are specifically looking at climate action, and obviously for us then good health and well-being goals. During the winter, I was part of a working group here where we did a small guide on foundations' responsible investing activities. And since then, I also did a number of interviews, interviewed 12 foundations here in Finland on their responsible investment activities. So this is kind of giving me a perspective. And also I did had 3 different analyses on our portfolio made, and I'm going to just show what kind of insights I got out of it. So here is like out of the 3 analyses, it's really difficult because the field is so complex. It's really difficult to get anything kind of a meaningful. But this is currently what I thought was the most interesting. So first of all, the scope. For listed equity, it's reasonably possible to get analysis and get things that have a meaning in terms of the ESGs. For bonds, I think it's close. We are expecting to see it close soon. For other fixed income, it's more difficult, and then for private equity, it's really more qualitative than really numbers based. The good news is that from the norms perspective, it's relatively easy to have a portfolio where all the funds are signatures of the UNPRI principles. However, we don't have a clue of how they are applying them, but at least there's an effort towards it. In the third picture, there is like analysis on the negative and positive impacts of our portfolio, again for the listed equity. And what is the good news is there that our negative impact compared to the benchmark, which would be the last portfolio index, is smaller. So both in the climate action and good health and well-being, because we exclude the tobacco and alcohol and so on, our negative impact is smaller, which is great. But on the other hand, our positive impact, it's not remarkably different from it's basically the index and not much more. So if we wanted to have a more positive impact, we would need to look at the private equity, probably do some concentrated efforts on that side. To conclude, I will just show a bit of what I think my learnings so far are. That currently the kind of a systematic analysis work best in the stock market, and that what is possible for an investor is very much dependent on how you invest. And the third thing is that it's really it takes an effort to learn about the practices. Luckily, the tools and the whole field is developing very rapidly, so it's getting better and better by day. But still, it takes an effort to learn about it. And to conclude, I have some thoughts on how for different kind of investment portfolios it works. So in a way, the easiest is if you have a direct stock portfolio where you can have, besides your normal regular investment criteria, you can then have either using scoring or screening, you can define what is your ESG criteria, or if you want to use specific SDGs, you can totally do so. And if you're a kind of a large enough investor, then even engagement with companies becomes possible. Then, however, if you're using funds, it's kind of a different game, because then you'd concentrate on the fund selection, and you then need to kind of understand what is the portfolio. And they're usually like third-party analysis services are mandatory. Nobody's gonna be able to build it on their own. And then, like what is our case is kind of outsourced asset management, and obviously the focus is on selecting the right manager. And then I think this is really important, is kind of have systematic integration with them all the time, asking like, where's our portfolio? How are you going to improve it? These are the important topics for us. And that's the way to actually get something going. And I think their foundations as a common group of investors can really make a difference in pushing the asset managers in action. And like a final, let's say, a warning that because it's so interesting now to do investments according to responsible principles and SDGs, there's a lot of offerings where it's not always very cost efficient, and also it's not clear what is the impact, and if it's like managed efficiently. Investors are usually very prudent in considering their returns, and now I'm calling that for the impact we should be as precise and prudent, so that we are not fooled by something that is just greenwashing or like good in principle but then not in practice. And the devil is always in the details, and with SDG investing, there's truly a lot of detail. So with these remarks, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Йони, спасибо большое. Да,
Yoni, thank you very much. Yes, you need to push this button to close.
Yes.
Olga, I have something I would like to add, because I think this is a very interesting subject. This is something we definitely need. We need this kind of business models, because this is something we lack entirely in the Russian philanthropic sector. I think this is the next stage in our development, with the larger foundations like our foundation, Art, Science and Sport Foundation, what Yoni just shared, where you can invest money in a different way. These are the kind of things where you can have real impact at a national level. I would say this is what we definitely lack here in Russia. Like, you have Jeff Bezos Foundation, you have venture investment in environmental startups. I think this is an excellent example of how the philanthropic community should evolve. At least larger foundations. That's the approach they should take. At this point, we don't have that yet. I don't even know what the problem is, but we don't see projects that would be good enough and would deserve this kind of funding that would be provided by larger foundations. But eventually this would take us to a whole new level. And I definitely believe this is the future. This is the next step for us. This is where we should be going. Once we become professional enough, once we are able to play a role, a link between business and the government, once we get to this point, we can make a much bigger contribution to global development. Yes, thank you, Fatima, for your contribution. You actually anticipated my question to Yoni. Yoni, I would like you to comment on this. I think that Northern Europe, in terms of SDGs, are ahead of many other countries, even the rest of Europe. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I believe there's some truth in it, because there's been certainly the big pension funds in Norway and Sweden have been leading the field, and for example the sovereign wealth fund in Norway, it's like globally so big that it's also an example for a lot of investors and a lot of asset managers. And for example, we have been benchmarking with them, so then it becomes easier once you have examples of, even though they are bigger investors, it becomes easier then for yourself to kind of understand what would be the things. But I need to say that at least in Finland, this is quite recent. There's not been a long tradition of ESG investing, so it's a new, but now there's a lot of interest. So I'm glad that it's happening now.
Olga, can I jump in?
Маркуса было, и у Макса были два высказывания. Давайте тогда Маркус и потом Макс.
Marcus, to you and then Max.
Just to say that, you know, we have been doing a lot of work around the issues that Uni's mentioned, right? Including, you know, a little bit of a kind of normative and standards that would help kind of minimize the risk of SDG washing, right? And also, how do you move from ESG, which is fantastic, it's if you want, one step away from traditional investment, but ESG is still a defensive mechanism of investment. It's still a do no harm mechanism, to the SDG investment, which is where you are deliberate, you know, searching for that investment that gives you a financial return, a environmental and a social return. We are working within the region pension fund that you only mentioned on how do you do that, and how do you find the pipeline for this, right? We have also investment standards, right? We are halfway in consultation for standards on the use of procedures of bonds, right? And we have just started public consultation for standards on enterprise. So our element of that, and two final comments here. One, we are actually delivering in about 3 weeks to the heads of governments of the G7. We are delivering together with the OECD the first ever sustainable finance framework. You know, we are going to make it public on November 12th, that tries to provide a framework for investors and governments on how to come together around standards, regulations, ability. Now, I was listening to Fatima, which in my country called Fatima, and it's my mother's name. So, you know, it's a great name. There is a huge potential for philanthropy here. Let me give you an example. COVID has put a lot of governments in a lot of debt problems. You have a huge number of, you know, middle-income countries countries, small island development states that have a debt crisis right now, asking governments on how to restructure their debt. What are the instruments, either thematic bonds like SDG bonds or green bonds, or debt swaps, right? Now, those instruments, they have one thing in common, right? They are thematic. So they have to deliver a result. So you have to construct a bond that says, I'm going to invest in renewable energy, or I'm going to do this before you go to market. Otherwise, the market won't buy, right? The market is very interested on those kinds of instruments. You know, we are negotiating with the Maldives now a debt swap for blue economy, for nature. Now, philanthropy can be a huge player in coming in, and it helps lower the conversation. Philanthropy can from the government, right? In exchange of the government investing in the areas that matter for philanthropy. Is what I said early on, is coming together, right? With other stakeholders to play at a much bigger level than you play right now. And that's one example of the kind of alternative investment that philanthropists can come in, joining a bunch of players, use its capital to de-risk a whole country debt, right? You know, in exchange for tight agreements that new revised, renegotiate that investments in health and in education, in renewable energy and in everything else.
Спасибо большое, Маркос.
Thank you, Marcus. I think Max wanted to add something. If I'm wrong, I will give the floor to other speakers. Max, would you like to say something?
Yeah, just very briefly, thank you. I wanted to add 2 points here. One is when you think about Daphne and our network, we represent around 511 billion euros in terms of assets. And this is, of course, quite a power in investing and giving direction. So there is this movement, Divest Invest, which gives good guidelines about how to think to be aligned with your mission when you start investing your endowments. That's a resource to share. And the other element is the work that the European Venture Philanthropy Association does with social investment. So using even money from your endowment to invest in mission-related projects, and not only for a return of a financial return, but also for a social return. So I just wanted to bring these 2 elements to your attention.
Коллеги, у меня есть 2 вопроса от аудитории.
I have 2 questions from our audience. I would like to ask them. The first question is more related to Russia. So it will be for Fatima and Oksana. But other speakers, feel free to add if you want to jump in. The question is the lack of financial flexibility and stability in most Russian philanthropic organizations. Can this become a barrier in their efforts to respond to the SDG agenda? So the lack of flexibility and financial instability of Russian NGOs, how does this affect their, do you think projects, we are obsessed, and of course I oversimplify right now, we are oversimplifying a result in the short term. We neglect long-term goals, long-term strategy objectives. So the trend in philanthropy right now is, I think the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the need for change. We need to reconsider and move on from project support to institutional support. Is this?
What we've learned on the SDG philanthropy platform is, indeed, it is true. We actually create a little app in the past, that allowed somebody just to say, this is what I'm doing, and it would automatically match what you're doing to an SDG and even to the targets of SDG. So it is true that, in philanthropy, almost everything you do is linked to the SDGs. But there is a fundamental difference when you realize, right, when it becomes clear to which aspects and to each target and to each indicator of the SDGs you are contributing to, right? That generates rigor, that generates measurement capabilities. Number one. Number two, the SDGs offer a common language, a common narrative across the stakeholders that didn't exist before. One thing is for foundation to say, I'm working in inclusive education. What does that mean to you might be very different than what it means to the government who wants to generate an inclusive education, or to a company that is, also care about inclusive education, or to an NGO. Through the SDG, we can actually all understand, oh, that's what inclusive education means. That is the target we are trying to achieve. And therefore, my own issue to come across the partnerships, and it's about the SDGs providing us with a common language that allow us to see a common objective, a common target, and then figure out how do we work together. That is a fundamental difference that it didn't exist before the
Marcus, reception is not very good.
The conversation we are having with RDF, with the Russian Donor. Sorry, I've said what I had to say. I hope you heard me.
Okay. There was some, the reception was not perfect, but I think the main idea we've heard. Thank you so much for that. Я бы еще хотела...
Can I jump in here just quickly, Olga?
Please.
I would say my answer to that question would be it really depends whether it makes any difference at all. If you are a very local foundation interested only in, inclusive education in a particular institution in your city, I don't think it makes that much of a difference whether you align your strategy with the SDGs or not. Probably will do the same work. Once you step on a national level and you're addressing national policies, it can make the differences that Marcus has just spoken about. And even more so if you try to work on things that are international and that you need to work with different governments, or if you work in development, so your inclusive education happens not in your own place, but in somebody else's country or city. If you're interested as local, I don't see that much of a difference, really. But it's hard to compare because, first of all, it's not the field that I'm usually in. But then I also think for some, it will make a difference because they take it as to be rigorous, and others will just continue to do the same good work they've always done.
Атье, спасибо большое.
Thank you, Atye. I want to add a few words as well. I think SDGs, these are trends put on paper. This is where our society is going, the direction we're taking. This is where we are going. So if you have this list in front of you, it's just easier for you. If you look it up from time to time, you get a better picture of what you should align yourself to. Or maybe some particular goals are not relevant for you, but they may become relevant later on. So I think it's just a way to better organize and better structure your working mentality. Yoni, I think you wanted to add a few words.
Yes, I would say that the difference is really in terms of I've been like studying the approach of impact investing, and that approach is quite clear, so that you are interested in the intentionality, so that it's not just that you do something that is like broadly in the SDGs, but it's that you have a goal that is measurable, and this is something you decide ahead, so that you will then be able to actually measure the impact. And then the other one would be that you are interested in kind of scaling, or rather looking at not maybe just funding a local project, but doing it in a way where it can benefit the larger society or larger goals. So I would say that that would be my kind of understanding how it would be different.
Спасибо большое. Я с своей стороны тоже хотела бы добавить такое, наверное.
Thank you. I also would like to add a comment. When I first saw how SDGs can work both globally and locally, this was when I saw a certain corporation, Metronica. They had a lot of volunteer projects, and each of the volunteers, and they have many, thousands and thousands of volunteers, all those volunteers, they had an application form, and their work was converted into particular SDGs. So just consider, you have these volunteers doing some work, helping people, but then they see how they contribute to a particular SDG with their volunteering. This can be a useful tool, you know, but we need to learn to use these tools properly. This changes your perspective. You see your contribution differently, the contribution of your company, of your foundation, your NGO, or you personally. I think we should make this language of SDGs more available to people, both globally and locally, and this will make our work more effective and bring us closer to achieving these goals. I have one more question for you, and again, this is a somewhat Russian question. Russia has what is known as national goals or national projects. It's the special goals that the Russian government has set for the entire country. And in Russia, everything that the government does, everything is evaluated in terms of national goals. So I want to ask our European colleagues, what do you think? Do you think national goals may stand in the way of SDGs? So you have this level as well. You have global SDGs, and in addition to that, nationally, Russia has its national goals. Well, personally, I would say that Russian national goals, they kind of correspond with international SDGs. There is no conflict here. It's just that Russia's national goals use somewhat different wording, and the areas may be structured a little differently, but generally speaking, it's pretty much one and the same thing. The goals are very similar. You always have national context. Each country is special in its own way. Some goals may be particularly relevant to a specific country. Other goals will be more relevant to another country. So we have these national goals in Russia, and I don't see any contradiction here. I think it's pretty much one and the same thing. Oksana, remember, I asked you whether Russia was special and different from other countries. So what do you say? Is there anything special? Is there any? You said both yes and no, but now we have more time. Maybe you could give a more expanded answer. Are we doing something locally here, or are we part of the global effort? Well, like Fatima said, Russia's national projects are just another version. I think it's pretty much SDGs translated into Russia's context. I don't think anybody expects all the countries to use the same tools to implement SDGs. I think Russia's national goals are just an application of SDGs to the Russian context. Me too, I don't see any contradiction here. it's pretty much the same thing. You just take into account Russia's national context and apply SDGs, make them work more effectively here. Thanks, Oksana. Anybody else? Do you want to comment on this particular subject or anything else? We've got 2 more minutes left, so feel free to jump in, or we can have some Q&A. Okay, if no, as the moderator, I have a question for all of you. We all know what global means during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. We all felt like parts of the global world. Of course, this was a sad occasion, but I share Marcus's optimism. I think this had a positive effect on SDGs. We no longer see them as something remote, something far away. We can all work together, moving towards the SDGs. So my last question to all of you: do you think the pandemic will result in a new SDG? Do you think they will add something? It will not just be health, SDG 3. Will they add another SDG to the list?
Let me take this as part of the organization that helped negotiate the SDGs. No, it won't happen. I think that the SDGs are a closed agenda, already very large agenda. You know, I think what we need to focus is what are the accelerators that COVID bring to go forward to the agenda. But no, I don't think there's going to be an 18th SDG or a replacement of a rather SDGs or not. If anything, the SDGs are very broad. So we've got it all in there.
Спасибо большое, Маркос. Ну вот, собственно говоря, на такой прекрасной ноте, что
Thanks, Marcus. That's great. I think the SDGs cover everything we need to make this world a better place. And we just need to accelerate our work towards this goal. Well, let me conclude our session here. And I'm very grateful to all of our speakers, to all those who sent in their questions, to all of our listeners, our entire audience. Thank you very much. And I hope we can meet face to face next year at the Russian Donors Forum annual conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga.
Thanks a lot.
To be here.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Всем до свидания.
Спасибо.
До свидания.
Bye-bye.
Спасибо.